Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what does it mean for the possible new world order?
On the border with Ukraine has turned now into an invasion.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a, quote, military operation in eastern Ukraine.
When Vladimir Putin sent his battalion of 200,000 soldiers to Ukraine on February 24, 2022, he expected to round off the military invasion in a few days. Months later, the war is far from over, with millions of Ukrainians displaced. Although Putin assured the world that he aimed to demilitarize Ukraine, it seemed like he had an ulterior motive. His primary aim was to topple the government, which he considered an enemy. Russian troops attempted to invade the presidential compound, but the efforts proved abortive. Russia claims that the media has exaggerated the report of genocide in eastern Ukraine, but the EU thinks otherwise, despite several calls for Russia to end the so-called special military intervention.
They need to act for the good of Russia. They need to stop him.
Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues its aggression, including additional sanctions.
Pleas have fallen on deaf ears. The EU adopted certain sanctions in response to Russia's unprovoked military attacks on Russia. These measures aim to weaken the country's economic base and deprive it of the critical technologies it needs to win the war. One such sanction is setting a price cap for crude oil. While this controversial policy is expected to limit Russia's power, some critics are skeptical about its efficacy. Before we get into the details of how this works and Russian strategies to overcome the temporary setback, please take a second to subscribe and like this video. Now that you've done that, we can get started. The G7 and US plan to cap oil. In November 2022, the G7, EU, and Australia agreed to set a limit on the price of Russian oil. They set the benchmark at $60 per barrel. This cap is significant since over 60% of the country's budget revenue is from oil and gas. Moreover, the revenue is used to finance the war in Ukraine. In May, the EU banned Russian seaborne crude oil. This ban covers 2/3 of Russian oil imports into the EU, and some analysts backed it as a symbol of EU unity. The aim was to put pressure on Moscow to end the war. While this embargo also affects EU operators that insure and finance ships with Russian crude oil, it does not apply to Russian oil imports coming into the bloc through a pipeline. For instance, the Druzhba oil pipeline, which started operation in 1964, has been supplying Russian oil to many Eastern and Central European countries like Slovakia, Austria, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany. As of 2021, Europe imported more than half of Russia's crude oil. Austria, Poland, and Germany support the ban and plan to implement it by the end of 2022. However, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic heavily depend on it. There are indications that Russian pipeline oil will be used temporarily until they develop an alternative. Some analysts say the price cap means Russia still has enough money to fund its military and support key industries. However, Western leaders are careful not to cut Russia's income and cause an oil shortage that would later spiral into inflation. Here are a few details you need to know about the G7 price cap on Russia's oil. This gives us a glimpse of the problem before understanding how Russia plans to maneuver the situation. What do the price cap and ban mean for the oil market? Before the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the 27-member bloc depended on Moscow's oil export. The country made $74.8 billion from oil in 2021 alone. The country was producing 2.2 million barrels per day. With this embargo coming into force on Monday, the bloc would be compelled to replace 1 million barrels of crude and 1.1 million barrels of oil products per day. However, about 10% of oil imports from the Druzhba oil pipeline will continue temporarily. Some analysts say the EU ban on Russian oil won't affect demand and supply in the bloc. However, they fear that Brent oil would be more expensive due to the ban. When the EU implemented the price cap, oil prices skyrocketed to 2%. The oil price cap prevents firms in the affected countries from providing insurance, trading, and shipping services for Russian crude if sold above the stipulated price. If these companies violate the rules, they will be held liable and slammed with sanctions. Russia may act like everything is fine, but deep down, it knows it has more to do. Oil production is expected to fall to 1.4 million barrels daily in 2023 when this ban is fully implemented. Russian critics say the country may try to evade these sanctions by registering in Liberia or Marshall Islands and removing their flags. But these tactics are outdated. For the EU to think of this regulation, they must have put certain things in place. They'll undoubtedly beef up maritime security to ensure Russian vessels don't evade sanctions. Moscow's immediate response to the announcement was that it would not accept it, but needed time to think about its next move. It announced that it would not supply oil to countries with anti-market price caps. Russia's strategy. Countries like Turkey, China, and India depend on Russia's oil and will continue to import it. Russia will negotiate with major buyers and arrange currency swaps. While this won't increase revenue significantly after the drastic drop, it will create a soft landing for them. Russia may sell off the books using anonymous tankers with obscure ownership, as Iran and Venezuela did. Oil could be transferred from one ship to another and mixed with products from other countries. Recent studies show that the number of Russian-affiliated oil tankers going dark to avoid detection has increased in recent months. Analysts say the monthly average of dark activities in the South Atlantic doubled in September and November 2022. There were 35 incidents in September, 50 in October, and 40 in November. Tankers that hide Russian links hope to avoid any price annexation of their cargo. Ami Daniel, the chief executive of Windward, confirmed that Russia has been learning how to circumvent sanctions from Iran and Venezuela. A report published in July 2022 revealed that 5 Chinese-owned ships were used to transfer Russian oil about 860 nautical miles west of Portugal's coast. Another publication also suggested that a tanker may have transported Russian crude under a Cameroon flag. Before visiting Cape Verde, the vessel changed its owner to a Seychelles-based company in June 2022. Even with this strategy, the cap will make it costlier, cumbersome, and time-consuming for Russia to sell in restricted regions. In response to this embargo, Russia can accept or reject it. Whatever side they choose, they must live with the consequences. Ulyanov, Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna, tweeted that Europe will live without Russian oil. Moscow already made it clear that it will not supply oil to those countries that support anti-market price caps. Very soon, the EU will accuse Russia of using oil as a weapon. End quote. As if this cap isn't enough torture, President Volodymyr Zelensky called for a lower price cap, saying the $60 doesn't go far enough. He suggested it be reduced to $30 to destroy his enemy's economy. Weeks after the G7, EU, and Australia officially agreed to the ban, the Russian government responded with a decree. It said that their actions were contradictory and unfriendly. Moscow outrightly banned its oil and oil products for affected foreign entities. The crude oil export ban is expected to kick off on February 1st and end on July 1st, 2023, while the date for the oil products ban will be determined later. Putin has the authority to overrule this decree only on special occasions. What would happen if Russia stopped the oil supply to Europe? Europe imported 3.8 million barrels of crude oil daily from Russia before the war. European customers can easily replace this with suppliers from the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and the US. But things are more challenging than we think. It would take time for the global market to adjust because refineries making gasoline are built for Russia's particular oil and several others depending on the pipeline from Russia. Experts at the Bruegel think tank say European countries may be forced to go harder to enforce this ban by reducing fuel use and making public transportation free. If these measures don't work, they can resort to tougher ones like odd-even driving bans based on license plate numbers. These measures would slowly take away interest in Russian oil. Russia might benefit from this ban because prices would likely go up. A price spike of $180 per barrel could happen, followed by a sharp fall due to decreasing demand. Since Russia is a major supplier of Europe's fuel for trucks and farm equipment, a shortage would affect a wide range of goods. Russian analysts are hopeful that the ban wouldn't affect revenue as much as the EU expects. If the country can find a market, it can remain in business. This means the government has to find new buyers for the 1.1 million barrels the EU refused to buy. This may be challenging, especially because coronavirus restrictions have slowed down the demand in big economies like China. Prospective customers may also be skeptical about buying from Russia since it is complex and risky. Analysts say these uncertainties may force Russia to reduce its oil output by 1.4 million barrels per day by early 2023. Russia is famous for offering mouth-watery discounts to Asian countries that patronize them. This may be a perfect opportunity to woo more countries into buying the deficit. India started the year by buying only 2% of its oil from Russia, but today, it is on course to make Russia one of the largest single suppliers. China's imports have also increased by 20% in 2022. There are indications that the Middle Eastern oil producers might buy Russian crude at discounted rates for processing in their overseas joint venture refineries while freeing up more of their barrels for export. This purchase might be as much as 200,000 barrels a day. We can only watch to see how things play out in the long run. The EU is Russia's largest crude oil market. Therefore, sanctions like these force Russia to rethink some of its policies. The country understands it can only utilize some of its oil and gas. It also knows the cost implications of importing to the Middle East. While everything seems normal now, we cannot say the same for the future. It may come to the point where these revenues are drastically reduced, and the country suffers for considerable revenue loss. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel as we update you on the latest sanctions from the EU and Russia's reaction to them. Give this video a thumbs up if it's been informative.